They laughed at her like she didn't matter. But in less than a minute, every single one of them would wish they had stayed quiet. The sun was high over the backyard, casting sharp reflections across the crystal blue pool as Emily Carter moved carefully along the edge, her sneakers damp, her uniform simple and faded from long days of work. Her hair tied back in a loose ponytail that kept falling over her shoulder no matter how many times she fixed it. And to everyone else gathered around that luxury estate, she was invisible, just the pool girl, just another worker who came and went without a name, without a story, without importance. But what they didn't notice was how steady her hands were, how calm her expression stayed even as voices started to rise behind her, laughter echoing across the patio like it belonged there more than she did. A group of guests lounged nearby, dressed in expensive summer outfits, holding chilled drinks, their conversations drifting lazily until one of them noticed Emily kneeling by the pool filter, and that was all it took for the mood to shift from casual to cruel. A smirk here, a whisper there, and suddenly she was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. "Hey, be careful. Wouldn't want you messing up the water," one woman said with a laugh that invited the others to join in, and they did, their amusement growing louder, sharper, as if her presence alone was something to joke about. Emily didn't look up, didn't respond, just kept working like she hadn't heard a thing, like their words had no weight, and that silence only encouraged them more, because people like that always expected a reaction, something to confirm their sense of control, but Emily gave them nothing, and that made them push harder. Another voice chimed in, mocking her job, her clothes, the way she moved, each comment layered with just enough bite to draw more laughter, and still, she stayed quiet, adjusting the skimmer, checking the water level, focused on the task in front of her as if the rest of the world didn't exist. But there was something about that calm that didn't fit the picture they had painted of her, something that felt out of place in a moment designed to make her small. One of the guests stepped closer, her sandals clicking against the stone, her tone playful but edged with something colder. "You even know what you're doing?" she asked, tilting her head as if genuinely curious, though the answer didn't matter, not to her, not to anyone watching, and a few phones subtly lifted, not enough to be obvious, just enough to capture whatever might happen next, because moments like this were entertainment for them, something to share, something to laugh about later. Emily finally paused for half a second, just long enough to reach for a towel beside her, dabbing a bit of water from her arm before returning to her work without a word. And that was when a flicker of confusion passed through the group, because her silence wasn't submission, it wasn't embarrassment, it was something else entirely, something controlled, something deliberate. And if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have noticed the way her eyes briefly scanned the reflection in the water, not at the people behind her, but beyond them, as if she was aware of something they weren't. The laughter continued, but it started to feel uneven now, forced in places, uncertain in others, like a performance that had gone on a little too long without the expected payoff. And still, Emily didn't react, didn't defend herself, didn't even acknowledge them. And that quiet refusal to engage created a tension that settled over the scene, subtle but undeniable, like the air just before a sudden shift, and none of them realized it yet. But they were already on the wrong side of a moment that was about to turn completely against them. The laughter did not stop, but it began to shift in tone, like a joke that had gone on too long and no longer felt as funny as it should have. Yet no one wanted to be the first to admit it, and so they doubled down, leaning into the moment as if louder voices could bring back the easy confidence they had just minutes before. One of the men sitting by the edge of the pool adjusted his sunglasses and smirked, making a comment about how long it was taking her to do such a simple job, and a few others nodded, eager to keep the attention on Emily, because as long as she remained the target, no one had to question themselves. Emily continued moving along the pool, checking the filter line, brushing along the tile with slow, precise strokes, her movements steady and unhurried, as though time belonged to her and not to the impatient crowd behind her. And that alone was enough to irritate them further, because nothing unsettles people more than someone who refuses to match their energy. Another guest stepped forward, her voice sharper now, less playful and more pointed, asking if Emily even understood how expensive this place was, as if that fact alone should make her nervous, as if it should force her into some kind of apology just for being there. But Emily did not answer, did not even turn around, and the silence stretched again, heavier this time, pressing against the edges of the group's confidence. Someone laughed again, but it sounded different, thinner, like it was trying too hard to fill the space, and a phone camera shifted slightly, capturing a closer angle, waiting for something more dramatic, something worth sharing. Because that was what this had become, not just a moment of casual cruelty, but a performance they expected to escalate. Emily set the brush aside and reached for the testing kit, dipping it carefully into the water, watching the colors change with a focus that seemed almost detached from everything happening around her. And for a brief second, the sunlight caught her expression in a way that made it clear she was not overwhelmed, not embarrassed, not even upset, just observant, aware, and entirely in control of herself. That was when the first hint of doubt truly settled in, subtle but unmistakable, because people like them were used to reactions, to flinches, to quick apologies or defensive words, something that confirmed the roles they had assigned. But Emily had not given them any of that, and without it, their assumptions started to feel less certain. Still, one of them refused to let it go, stepping closer with a forced smile and asking if she needed help, the kind of question that was not really an offer but a way to remind her of her place. And even then, Emily simply shook her head slightly, a small, polite gesture, and continued with her work, her calm now almost impossible to ignore. The group exchanged glances, brief and uncertain, as if silently asking each other why this did not feel the way it was supposed to. Why? The moment was slipping out of their control, even though nothing obvious had changed, and that was when a faint sound of footsteps approached from behind them, quiet at first, almost lost beneath the lingering chatter, but steady, deliberate, carrying a presence that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with certainty. No one turned immediately, too focused on the scene in front of them, too committed to the roles they were playing. But Emily noticed, not by looking up, but by the slight shift in reflection across the surface of the water, the outline of someone entering the space behind the group, and for the first time, there was the smallest pause in her movement, just enough to acknowledge that something had changed. The voices behind her continued for another second, maybe two, before one of the guests finally glanced over their shoulder, their expression shifting almost instantly from casual amusement to something more alert, more cautious, and that change spread quickly, like a ripple moving through the group, one person after another turning to see who had arrived, their posture adjusting, their tone lowering without anyone needing to say a word. Emily remained where she was, still kneeling by the pool, her hand resting lightly on the edge, her gaze steady on the water, as if she had been expecting this moment all along, and whatever was about to happen next was not a surprise to her. But to everyone else, it was the beginning of something they had not prepared for. The shift in the air was immediate, subtle but undeniable, as conversations that had once been loud and careless dropped into uncertain silence, and the same people who had been laughing just moments ago now stood a little straighter, their expressions tightening as they turned to face the man who had just stepped into the scene, his presence calm, but commanding in a way that did not need to announce itself. Daniel Brooks did not raise his voice, did not rush. He simply walked forward at a measured pace, his gaze moving briefly across the group before settling on Emily. And there was something in that look that did not match the assumptions everyone else had made about her, something that carried recognition, respect, and quiet certainty. No one spoke at first, as if they were all waiting for someone else to explain what was happening. But Daniel did not offer explanations. He did not ask questions. Instead, he stopped just a few feet from where Emily was kneeling by the pool and said her name in a tone that was steady and familiar. Emily. And that single word landed heavier than anything that had been said before, because it changed everything without needing to explain why. Emily looked up then, not startled, not confused, just calm, as if this moment had been expected, and she gave a small, acknowledging nod, the kind that suggested this was not their first interaction, not even close. And that realization moved through the group like a quiet shock, because the pool girl they had been mocking suddenly had a name, and not just any name, but one spoken with a level of respect they could not ignore. One of the guests let out a soft, nervous laugh, trying to recover the atmosphere, asking if everything was all right. But the question felt misplaced now, Unnecessary, because it was clear that whatever dynamic had existed before was no longer in control. Daniel's attention shifted briefly toward the group, his expression composed, unreadable, yet firm in a way that made it clear he was fully aware of what had just taken place. And though he did not repeat their words or call anyone out directly, the silence he held was enough to make several of them look away. Their earlier confidence fading under the weight of being seen for exactly what they had done, Emily rose slowly to her feet, brushing her hands lightly against her uniform, still composed, still quiet. And for the first time, the difference between how she carried herself and how they had perceived her became impossible to ignore, because there was no trace of embarrassment in her posture, no sign that she had been diminished by the situation, only a steady presence that now seemed completely at odds with the role they had assigned to her. Daniel reached out slightly, not in a dramatic gesture, but in a simple, practical one, offering his jacket as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and Emily accepted it without hesitation, draping it over her shoulders with the same calm ease she had shown from the beginning. And that small interaction, quiet and understated, spoke louder than any explanation could have. The group exchanged glances again, but this time there was no amusement left, only uncertainty, the kind that comes when a situation no longer makes sense, when the assumptions that once felt solid begin to unravel without warning, and someone finally asked the question that had been building in the back of everyone's mind, who exactly she was. But Daniel did not answer immediately. He simply looked back at Emily for a brief second, as if giving her the space to speak if she wanted to, and when she did not, when she remained silent by choice rather than hesitation, he turned his attention back to the group, and the calm in his voice carried something stronger now, something that made it clear that whatever came next would not be what they expected. The pool, the sunlight, the setting that had once felt like a stage for casual entertainment now seemed different, quieter, as if the entire moment had shifted into something far more serious. And the people who had been so certain just minutes ago now found themselves waiting, unsure, because for the first time, they were no longer the ones in control of the story. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that made people shift their weight and glance at each other, searching for cues on how to react. But none came, because Daniel Brooks did not rush to fill it, and that control, that patience, made the moment feel even heavier than any raised voice could have. He took a slow breath, his eyes moving across the group one more time, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that made it impossible to hide behind laughter or excuses. And when he finally spoke, his tone was even, measured, yet unmistakably firm, as if every word had been chosen before he said it. I think there has been a misunderstanding here. And though the sentence sounded simple, it carried a weight that immediately drew everyone's attention, because it did not ask what happened. It suggested that what they believed was already wrong. One of the guests tried to respond quickly, stepping forward with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, explaining that they were just having a little fun, that no one meant anything serious by it. Her voice light, but edged with urgency, as if she could smooth the situation over before it turned into something bigger. But Daniel did not interrupt her. He let her finish, and when she did, he gave a small nod, acknowledging her words without agreeing to them. And that distinction, subtle as it was, made her confidence falter. He then turned slightly toward Emily, his posture shifting just enough to signal that she was not an afterthought in this conversation, that she was, in fact, central to it. And that realization settled over the group with quiet force, because everything about the situation was now pointing away from their assumptions. Emily stood there calmly, Daniel's jacket resting over her shoulders, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression steady, and there was something in the way she held herself that now seemed impossible to dismiss, something that suggested she had never been out of place to begin with, only perceived that way by those who had not taken the time to look closer. Daniel spoke again, this time more directly, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to make it clear that what he was about to say mattered. Emily is here because I asked her to be. And that single statement shifted the entire foundation of the moment, because it introduced a connection that none of them had anticipated, one that immediately raised questions they had not considered before. A murmur moved through the group, quiet but noticeable, as people tried to process what that meant, and someone asked, carefully now what exactly he meant by that. Their tone no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but cautious, as if they were stepping into unfamiliar territory. Daniel did not answer right away, instead allowing the question to linger, giving it space to settle. And in that pause, the weight of his earlier words grew, because it was clear that this was not a casual explanation, not something that could be brushed aside with a quick laugh or a simple apology. He glanced once more at Emily, and for a brief moment, there was a shared understanding between them, something unspoken but unmistakable. And then he looked back at the group, his expression steady, composed, and said, "She is not just someone maintaining the pool." And though he stopped there, leaving the sentence incomplete, the implication was already enough to shift the atmosphere entirely. The people who had been so confident just minutes ago now stood in a quiet uncertainty, their earlier assumptions unraveling piece by piece, because whatever role they had assigned to Emily no longer fit, and the more they tried to hold on to it, the less sense it made. One of them lowered their phone completely, no longer interested in recording. Another crossed their arms, not in defiance but in discomfort, and the energy that had once fueled their laughter was gone, replaced by a growing awareness that they had misjudged the situation in a way that could not simply be undone. Emily remained silent through all of it, not stepping forward to explain, not rushing to correct anyone, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. And that silence, once again, spoke louder than anything she could have said, because it made it clear that whatever was about to be revealed was not something she needed to prove. It was something that would stand on its own. And as Daniel prepared to continue, the entire group found themselves waiting, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a quiet realization that the story they thought they understood was about to change completely. The tension in the air thickened, no longer uncertain but expectant, as every pair of eyes shifted between Daniel and Emily, waiting for the missing piece that would finally make sense of everything that had just happened. And yet neither of them rushed to fill that silence, because the power of the moment was not in speed but in control, in allowing the truth to arrive exactly when it was meant to. Daniel took a small step forward, his presence steady and composed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet authority that made it impossible to ignore. "Emily Carter was recommended to me personally." And that sentence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere further, because it introduced a level of intention that none of them had considered. This was not random, not accidental, not a simple hiring choice made out of convenience. A few of the guests exchanged glances, their expressions tightening as they tried to process what that meant, because people in Daniel's position did not make personal recommendations lightly, and certainly not for something as ordinary as pool maintenance. And that realization began to chip away at the last pieces of their confidence. Daniel continued, his tone calm but precise. "She has been working closely with one of my most trusted partners over the past year." And though he did not name the partner, the implication was enough, because anyone familiar with his business knew that his inner circle was not easily earned. And suddenly the narrative they had built in their minds started to collapse under the weight of that information. Emily remained still beside him, her expression unchanged, her silence now carrying a different meaning, no longer mistaken for submission but understood as restraint, as if she had chosen from the beginning not to reveal more than necessary. And that choice now seemed deliberate, almost strategic. One of the guests let out a quiet breath, attempting to recover some sense of control, asking what exactly Emily's role was, her voice careful, respectful in a way it had not been before. And that shift alone spoke volumes about how quickly perception could change when new information entered the picture. Daniel paused for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood the value of timing, of allowing the weight of the question to settle before responding. And when he did speak, his words were clear, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. "She has been helping evaluate operational efficiency across several of my properties." And with that, the final piece of the illusion shattered, because Emily was no longer just someone maintaining the pool. She was someone assessing it, observing it, understanding it on a level that none of them had even considered. The reaction was immediate, though no one spoke loudly, no one laughed, no one tried to dismiss it. Instead, there was a quiet shift, a collective realization that the roles had been reversed without them even noticing. that the person they had been judging was, in fact, in a position to judge them. A phone that had once been raised for amusement was slowly lowered and slipped out of sight. A glass was set down carefully on a nearby table, and the casual posture that had defined the group just minutes ago was replaced by something far more rigid, far more aware. Emily adjusted the jacket slightly around her shoulders, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a simple, practical one. And in that small movement, there was a quiet confidence that now felt completely natural, as if this version of her had always been there, only hidden behind assumptions that no longer held any weight. Daniel's gaze moved across the group once more, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with a steady expectation, as if he was giving them the opportunity to understand what had just happened without needing to spell it out. And that expectation carried its own kind of pressure, because it required them to acknowledge their mistake without being directly told to do so. One of them finally spoke, offering a brief apology. The words careful and measured, lacking the ease they had once had. And though it was not a full admission, it was enough to signal that the dynamic had completely changed, that the confidence they once held had been replaced by something far more cautious. Emily did not respond to the apology, not out of disregard, but out of choice, because she did not need to accept it in that moment. She did not need to validate it, and that silence, once again, reinforced the idea that her value had never been dependent on their recognition. The sunlight still reflected off the pool, the setting unchanged, yet everything about the moment felt different now, as if a curtain had been pulled back to reveal a truth that had been there all along, waiting for the right time to be seen. And as Daniel prepared to speak again, it was clear that this was not the end of the revelation, but only the beginning of something much larger than any of them had expected. The realization settled deeper, not as a sudden shock anymore, but as a slow, undeniable weight pressing down on everyone present. Because the more Daniel spoke, the clearer it became that this was not a misunderstanding that could be brushed aside. It was a complete reversal of everything they thought they knew, and that kind of shift does not leave room for easy recovery. Daniel let the silence stretch again, not out of hesitation, but with purpose, allowing each person to fully absorb what had just been revealed. And when he continued, his voice remained calm, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now. Something that made it clear this was no longer just about explanation, it was about accountability. Emily has been reviewing service standards across multiple properties, including this one, and that statement landed with precision because it connected her presence directly to this very moment, to this exact place, turning what they had treated as an ordinary day into something far more significant. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably, their earlier posture completely gone now, replaced by a stiffness that came from understanding they were no longer observers, but part of the evaluation itself, and the idea that their behavior had been seen, not just by Emily, but now by Daniel as well, created a tension that none of them could ignore. Emily stood quietly, her gaze steady, not directed at anyone in particular, but not avoiding them either. And there was something in that composure that made it clear she had been aware of this dynamic long before they had, that she had allowed it to unfold without interference because it revealed something real, something unfiltered. One of the guests attempted to speak again, offering a more direct apology this time, her voice lower, more sincere, but also uncertain, as if she was not entirely sure what the appropriate response should be anymore. And that uncertainty was shared by the rest of the group, because the usual social cues no longer applied. Daniel acknowledged the apology with a slight nod, but he did not immediately accept it, nor did he dismiss it. Instead, he shifted his focus slightly, broadening the scope of the conversation. What matters is not just what is said when things are comfortable, he said evenly, but how people choose to act when they believe no one is watching. And that line carried a quiet finality, because it addressed the situation without needing to repeat it, without needing to call out specific actions. It simply reframed the entire moment in a way that made its meaning unavoidable. The group fell completely silent now, not out of confusion, but out of understanding, because there was no longer any ambiguity about what had taken place or how it was being perceived. Emily adjusted her stance slightly, the jacket still resting over her shoulders. And for the first time, she spoke, her voice calm, measured, and clear. I always prefer to see things as they are, not as they are presented. And though her words were simple, they carried a depth that immediately reframed her role even further, because they revealed intent, not just observation but purpose, and that purpose now felt fully realized in this moment. Daniel glanced at her briefly, a subtle acknowledgement that required no further explanation, and then looked back at the group, his expression steady. "And now we have," he said, and that statement, though short, felt conclusive, as if it marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The atmosphere around the pool had completely transformed, the sunlight still bright, the water still calm, but the energy entirely different. No longer casual, no longer dismissive, but reflective, almost restrained, as if everyone present was now aware that they were standing in the aftermath of something they could not undo. One by one, the small details of the earlier scene seemed to fade, the laughter, the comments, the casual assumptions, all replaced by a quiet recognition that they had misjudged not just Emily, but the situation itself, and that realization carried a weight far heavier than any direct confrontation could have. Emily did not look for validation, did not wait for further apologies. She simply stood there, composed, present, and entirely unchanged from the moment she first arrived. The only difference now being that everyone else had finally caught up to the reality she had been operating in all along. And as Daniel prepared to take the next step, it became clear that this moment was not just about correcting a misunderstanding. It was about setting a standard, one that would extend far beyond this single interaction. The moment did not end with raised voices or dramatic reactions. Instead, it settled into something far more powerful, a quiet clarity that left no room for denial. And as the group stood there processing everything, Daniel took a small step forward, not to dominate the space, but to define it, his presence steady, his tone measured, as if what he was about to say was not just for them, but for anyone who might ever stand in a similar position. "Standards are not tested when things are easy," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that held everyone's attention. "They are revealed in moments like this." And that statement did not accuse, it did not shame, but it made the meaning of the situation unmistakably clear, because it shifted the focus away from Emily entirely and placed it squarely on the behavior that had unfolded around her. No one responded immediately, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too well. And that understanding came with a quiet discomfort that could not be avoided or dismissed. And in that silence, the earlier laughter felt distant, almost unreal, like something that no longer belonged in the same space. Emily remained beside him, composed as ever, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in how she was perceived now, no longer as someone being observed, but as someone who had been observing all along. And that reversal was complete, leaving no trace of the assumptions that had once defined her presence. One of the guests finally spoke, her voice steady but noticeably softer, offering a more sincere apology this time. Not rushed, not defensive, but reflective. And though she did not speak for everyone, the sentiment carried across the group, because it was clear that the moment had moved beyond individual reactions and into something collective, something that affected all of them. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression neutral, not dismissive but not immediately forgiving either, because what mattered now was not just the words being said, but the understanding behind them, and that could not be rushed. When she finished, he gave a small nod, acknowledging the effort, and then turned slightly toward Emily, not to put her on the spot, but to give her the space to respond if she chose to. And for a brief second, all attention shifted to her, not with expectation, but with a quiet respect that had not been there before. Emily took a small breath, her gaze steady, and spoke with the same calm clarity she had shown from the beginning. "Respect is not something you turn on when it is convenient," she said, her voice even, her tone free of anger or judgment. "It is something you carry, or you do not." And those words, simple as they were, landed with a weight that no one could ignore, because they did not just address what had happened. They defined a standard that extended far beyond it. The group remained silent, not out of confusion, but out of reflection, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to defend, only something to consider. And that kind of realization often speaks louder than any confrontation. Daniel glanced at her briefly, a subtle acknowledgement of the point she had made, and then looked back at the group, his expression steady. "This is exactly why she is here," he added, reinforcing what had already been made clear, that Emily's presence was not accidental, not incidental, but intentional, and that intention carried meaning far beyond a single task or role. The atmosphere around the pool had fully transformed now, no longer defined by casual conversation or light amusement, but by a quiet awareness that something important had just taken place, something that would not be easily forgotten. And as the sunlight continued to reflect across the water, the stillness of the scene seemed to mirror the shift that had occurred within it, calm on the surface, but fundamentally changed beneath. Emily adjusted the jacket once more, not out of necessity, but as a natural movement, and in that small gesture, there was a sense of closure, not in the sense that everything had been resolved, but in the sense that the truth had been revealed, and that revelation carried its own kind of finality. No one reached for their phones. Now, no one attempted to lighten the mood, because it was clear that this was not a moment to be captured or dismissed. It was a moment to be understood, and as Daniel prepared to move forward, it was evident that what had just happened was not an isolated incident, but part of something larger, something that would extend beyond this single afternoon and into decisions yet to be made. No one spoke for a few seconds after Emily's words settled in, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to reinterpret, only a quiet acceptance that the moment had revealed more than any of them had expected, and in that stillness, the dynamic that once felt so clear had completely dissolved, leaving behind something far more honest, far more difficult to ignore. Daniel let that silence remain just long enough to ensure it was understood, then shifted his posture slightly, signaling that what came next would move beyond reflection and into action, not dramatic or harsh, but deliberate, the kind of action that defines what truly matters when everything else has been stripped away. He glanced briefly toward the patio, then back at the group, his voice calm, but carrying a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. "I will be reviewing all current service contracts for this property," he said, and though the statement was delivered evenly, it carried immediate weight, because it connected their behavior directly to consequences, not as punishment, but as a natural outcome of what had been observed. A subtle ripple moved through the group, not panic, but realization, because this was no longer just a social misstep. It had become something that could affect decisions, reputations, and opportunities, and that understanding shifted their posture even further, from discomfort into quiet accountability. One of the guests nodded slowly, as if acknowledging what was being said without needing further explanation, while another looked down briefly, her expression thoughtful, as though replaying the earlier moments with a new perspective that could not be undone. Emily remained composed, her presence steady, not reacting to the shift, not seeking validation or satisfaction, because for her, this was never about proving a point, it was about revealing one, and now that it had been revealed, there was nothing more she needed to add. Daniel continued, his tone unchanged. "The way people are treated in any environment reflects the standards we choose to uphold." And that statement extended beyond the immediate situation, making it clear that what had happened was not isolated. It was part of a broader expectation, one that applied to everyone involved, regardless of their role or status. The group listened without interruption, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet attentiveness, because they understood now that this was not about a single incident. It was about a pattern, a mindset, something that could not simply be corrected with a quick apology, but required a deeper awareness. Emily took a small step back, not to withdraw, but to create space, her role in the moment complete, her presence no longer the focus but the catalyst for what had unfolded, and as she did, the weight of what had been revealed seemed to settle more fully across the group, as if her quiet strength had left an imprint that would remain long after she walked away. One of the guests spoke again, her voice steadier now, not defensive, not performative, but genuine, expressing a desire to do better, to understand what had been overlooked, and though her words were simple, they carried a sincerity that had been absent before, and that shift, small as it was, marked the beginning of something different, something more aware. Daniel acknowledged her with a slight nod, not offering reassurance, but recognizing the effort, Because change, real change, does not come from being told what to do. It comes from understanding why it matters, and that understanding was now beginning to take shape. The sunlight continued to reflect off the pool, the water calm and undisturbed, a quiet contrast to the shift that had taken place around it. And in that stillness, the entire scene felt redefined, no longer a place of casual gathering, but a space where something important had been revealed and could not be ignored. Emily adjusted the jacket one last time, her gaze steady as she looked out across the pool, not at the group, but beyond them, as if already moving forward, already focused on what came next, and that quiet forward motion signaled that for her. This moment was not an ending, but a continuation of something much larger. Daniel turned slightly, aligning himself with that same direction, and though he did not say anything further, his presence made it clear that the decisions ahead would reflect everything that had just been shown, not out of reaction, but out of principle. And as the group stood there, absorbing the full weight of what had unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a lesson learned in a single afternoon, but a standard set in a way that would not easily be forgotten. The moment did not end with applause or dramatic closure. Instead, it settled into a quiet understanding that lingered in the air long after the words had been spoken, and as Daniel began to walk toward the far side of the patio, Emily followed beside him, not behind, not ahead, but in step, a subtle detail that now carried meaning no one could ignore. The group remained where they were, no longer gathered by shared amusement, but held in place by reflection, each person processing the shift in their own way, because what had happened was not just a change in perception, it was a confrontation with something deeper, something about how easily assumptions can define behavior when left unchecked. One of the guests slowly picked up her glass again, not to drink, but to hold, as if grounding herself in something familiar, while everything else felt slightly altered. Another glanced at the pool, its surface still smooth and bright, yet now representing something entirely different from what it had just moments ago, no longer a backdrop for casual conversation, but a silent witness to a moment that had redefined the space. Emily paused briefly near the edge, her gaze moving across the water one last time, and there was a calm certainty in her expression, not satisfaction, not vindication, but clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are regardless of how others choose to see you. And that clarity remained unchanged from the beginning. The only difference now being that it had finally been recognized. Daniel stopped beside her, his posture relaxed but intentional, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no need to. The outcome had already been established, not through force, not through confrontation, but through truth revealed at the right time. Behind them, the group began to shift, small movements at first, a step back, a quiet conversation, a lowered voice, as if they were recalibrating not just the moment, but themselves. And though no formal conclusion had been announced, it was clear that something had ended and something else had begun, a new awareness that would follow them beyond this afternoon. One of them finally spoke again, not loudly, not for attention, but simply to acknowledge what had been learned, her words quiet, sincere, carrying none of the earlier tone that had defined her presence, and though it was not directed at anyone in particular, it reflected a shift that extended beyond individual accountability into something more personal, more lasting. Emily did not turn back to respond, not because she dismissed it, but because she did not need to. Her role in this moment had never been to collect apologies or prove a point. It had been to reveal something real, and that had already been done. Daniel glanced once more toward the group, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a steady acknowledgement that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what would happen next, and that distinction left the responsibility where it belonged, not with him, not with Emily, but with those who had witnessed the moment and now had the opportunity to carry it forward. The sunlight began to soften slightly as the afternoon moved on, casting longer reflections across the pool, and in that subtle change, there was a sense of transition, not just in time, but in understanding, as if the space itself had absorbed what had taken place and would not return to what it had been before. Emily adjusted the jacket gently before handing it back to Daniel, a small, respectful gesture that marked the quiet closing of the moment, and as he accepted it, there was a shared recognition between them, not of victory, but of alignment, of purpose carried out exactly as intended. Without another word, they continued walking, leaving the patio behind, not in retreat, but in completion, because everything that needed to be said had already been shown, and as they disappeared from view, the group was left with more than just a memory of what had happened. They were left with a standard, one that would quietly influence every interaction that followed, long after the moment itself had passed. And in that way, the story did not end at the pool. It simply moved forward, carried in the choices that would be made from that point on.